Hello and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's podcast on the most pressing issues impacting the transatlantic partnership today. My name is Jan Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center, and I'm delighted to be doing a new mini-series of our debriefs following the release of our report, Transatlantic Horizons, a collaborative USEU policy agenda for 2025 and beyond. Amid a year of elections and leadership turnover on both sides of the Atlantic, this report looks to set a productive vision and agenda for transatlantic cooperation for years to come and offer a vision for the next U.S. administration and European Commission. To discuss this section of this report, my guest today is Dan Mullaney, a non-resident senior fellow with both the Europe Center and our colleagues at the Geoeconomics Center here at the Atlantic Council. And known to many, Dan was previously Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Europe and the Middle East for many years and was deeply involved in transatlantic trade negotiations and trade issues for many years. Dan, a warm welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Jordan. Real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Dan authored an important section of that report I mentioned, which he colorfully entitled Closing the Gap Between Mars and Venus, focusing on transatlantic trade issues and bridging the differences between a perceived gap in transatlantic attitudes toward trade. And as Dan and our viewers know, trade between the United States and the EU is the backbone of the transatlantic partnership, and just trade in goods and services reached around $1.3 trillion last year. There's obviously also the investment side of that relationship. But we've also seen some significant shifts in trade policy on both sides of the Atlantic, and that's the main reason we're really excited to have Dan here to unpack some of the ideas and points that he discusses in his piece that everyone here has to look up in the report. So let's get started with the basics. Tell us why you chose that title of transatlantic trades and and overcoming this difference between Mars and Venus, between the United States and the European Union. Give us a sense of why you chose that angle, Dan.
Well, thanks. It is somewhat of a provocative title, maybe raises some questions. The underlying thesis is that there is an underlying assumption among policymakers, think tankers, and others that the U.S. and the EU have almost an unbridgeable divide between them in terms of fundamental approaches toward international trade. In the words of Robert Kagan a couple of decades ago, the United States is from Mars, EU is from Venus. And I think that manifests itself today in maybe accusations or underlying assumptions that, the U.S. is sort of a rule breaker and the EU is a rule follower, or the U.S. is primarily unilateral and the EU is multilateral, or the EU is very pro-WTO and the U.S. is anti-WTO. And that fundamental underlying assumption, the narrative in the trade relationship really creates serious obstacles to the coordination that we need to have to face these coming challenges: non-market economy policies and practices, environment, supply chain vulnerabilities, our joint competitiveness. And so I picked that one theme because instead of talking about a dozen different issues that the US and EU have, because it's the one single thing that which, if we could overcome it, would cut across all of the areas in which we have to cooperate.
Let me follow up by asking you about all of those areas a little bit before we dive into something more forward-looking. You list out some of them in your memo as part of this larger report, but can you take us through some of those issues that are on the USEU agenda that are fueling, where the dynamics are fueling that overall theme that you identified?
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. Not in necessarily order of priority, but we both have challenges of climate change and how trade policy can address climate change and how you can do that in the context of current rules. We have issues of labor protections. We have issues of our joint competitiveness and what we do together to encourage manufacturing in key high-tech industries of the future. We have the joint issue of supply chain vulnerabilities, becoming overly dependent on one supplier for critical components. We have the basket of non-market economy policies and practices, which have become very prevalent in international trade, present challenges to us, both to our competitiveness and to our vision of a regulatory system based on rule of law. So all of these challenges are cascading now, becoming much more critical, much more important, making it much more important than it ever was for us to be working together, both so that the individual measures that we take to address these challenges, and we have them, the IRA, the Recovery Act, any number of things. The EU has them, CBAM, deforestation. We will take unilateral measures to address these common challenges. And unless we work together, we'll be each much less effective in achieving that goal. And we will risk collateral damage to the relationship if we're not working together on achieving these common goals.
Maybe on those last few points. So what's different now? Because critics would say, we've seen this shift and we're stuck in that dynamic a little bit on both sides that you already described, in these unilateral measures, the inability to resolve issues between us. Where do you see the opening for a more collaborative and change to that dynamic and narrative, and an opening for a more collaborative trade policy agenda and new initiatives?
I mean, I think, one of the things that's different now from several years ago is it's becoming blindingly apparent to both of us that we have these joint challenges, that they do represent threats to our common values. And so I think the critical nature and the concrete nature of all these challenges is much more important to us now than it was several decades ago. I mean, we all know that it sometimes takes a crisis like Russia invading Ukraine or other crises for us to get together and really work together. And I think we are arriving at that point now, and we weren't there, say, several decades ago, but we are arriving at that point now where it is approaching a crisis situation, and it becomes apparent that we really do need to work together. I think one of the other things that's different and maybe will facilitate our working together is, in the past, I think we were maybe underappreciated the importance of and the tools available to reach out to stakeholders, to communicate what we're doing, to receive input from stakeholders, especially when it comes to social media. And I think in the past, we were much less attuned to the importance and the use of the social media, and also related to the use of misinformation and disinformation in disrupting the relationship. And I do think that now we're in a much different place, a much better place. We have, I think, a recognition of these crises. I think we have better tools now, better knowledge of how to use social media and other means of communicating with stakeholders. And I think we have a better handle on how to counter some of the disinformation tactics that we encountered in the past.
So you've spoken about the dynamics in the past, about what sort of some of those challenges were. We've spoken about the strategic imperative of getting this right. What is the right level of ambition? What are some of the specific areas where you see the US and the EU able to move forward? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about, do we need to go back to comprehensive agreement negotiation? Is it easier to do a sectorals or a bundle of sectoral agreements? What is the right level and scope of ambition here?
The United States and Europe were very ambitious in setting up the current world trading system after the war. And so I think we can justifiably be very ambitious of how we meet these newer challenges. I think some of those include how we use trade tools to combat climate change. And I think the discussions that have been happening in the context of steel and aluminum and how we reach a new kind of arrangement with the EU that incentivizes market economy steel and aluminum, and also steel aluminum that is sustainable in terms of carbon content. I think we do require, it does require looking at the rules, creative use of those rules, maybe new tools for achieving a trade policy that is compatible with the climate. And I also think we are, each of us, engaging in certain industrial policies to encourage, through supports, other methods, manufacturing in key areas. I think we need to get together and figure out what the rules of the road for that should be. I mean, many years ago, we negotiated this subsidies and countervailing measures agreement. It was adequate to the task decades ago. I think now we're in maybe a different place where we need to set out some rules of the road that take into account our need to use some of these policies to increase our competitiveness. I do think in terms of the mechanics of the way forward, I think we've had some very good successes in the TTC, working along many different tracks on the relationship, and that's been very important. I think what is going to be more important going forward is that we gather together the trade and investment issues in a single package that is sort of a more comprehensive trade and investment package, where our priorities can be on the table, EU's priorities can be on the table, the joint priorities can be on the table, and we can create some momentum for moving forward in the trade and investment relationship between us. So I think some form of combined, comprehensive trade and investment negotiation aiming towards an agreement, I think would be the best way forward for us.
Thank you, Dan. Anything else you would highlight from your recommendations? I mean, I encourage everyone to read your piece and the broader report, of course, but anything else you would highlight that is needed to really get out of this old dynamic, let's say, and into a much more constructive and effective phase of cooperation?
Yes, I really think that anyone who is involved in the Atlantic Council reads their materials. They all have a role to play in this. So this is not a policy recommendation for everybody else. All the think tank people work in think tanks, people work in academia, people who work in this area, in the government, outside of government, I think can all contribute to this a shift in attitude about how the U.S. or the importance of the U.S. and EU working together, and walking away from this somewhat simplistic dynamic of Europe and the United States have these fundamental differences, and every time there's a disagreement, we need to attribute that to fundamental differences. I think everyone watching this video, everyone reading the piece has a role to play in promoting a constructive dialogue that builds support for very close cooperation between the United States and Europe.
Well, thank you, Dan. I think that's all we have time for. That's the perfect note to end on, calling on all of us to play our piece in this relationship and in this specific area of USEU trade policy and trade cooperation. Dan, thank you so much for spending the time to give us a little bit of a sense of that piece. I encourage all of our viewers to check out the reports and obviously Dan's memo under the title of Transatlantic Horizons, a collaborative US-EU policy agenda for 2025 and beyond. And check out the other videos and debriefs that we've done on each of the memos. And with that, thank you for joining us today Hope to see you very soon. Read the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorn.